Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this. Today's topic is social emotional learning, and I know that that's a really big topic right now for a lot of folks as schools have closed down and schools are using this new lens of remote learning. So a little bit about me before we get started. My name is Sam Drazin. I am a former elementary educator. I taught third grade and fifth grade in public schools for a number of years. And I left the classroom about 6 years ago to move into this new role of being the founder and executive director of Changing Perspectives, as well as traveling at a national level, presenting to teachers and parents and students around the ideas of equity, inclusion of students with disabilities, and really kind of the role that social emotional learning plays in creating equitable, inclusive learning environments for all students. So my email address is up here on this slide. Feel free to reach out to me at any point if you want to have a further discussion beyond this webinar. So before I jump into the content of today's webinar, I want to give you a little more background on the lens that I bring to this work from my professional work with Changing Perspectives. So Changing Perspectives is an educational nonprofit organization. We work with schools across the country to create equitable and inclusive learning environments for all students. And we do that through a combination of trainings for teachers and parents. We do that through curriculum materials, consultations, and a variety of other resources and programming offerings to schools to really help them think about these ideas in the most impactful way possible. But now, of course, schools are kind of flipped upside down and they're struggling with these issues in a remote learning setting. So before I go any further, I want to talk a little bit about what is social emotional learning. So what is SEL? CASEL, which is an organization based in Chicago, is a really good resource, I would say, for social emotional learning. And as I was preparing today's webinar, if you Google definition of social emotional learning, you're going to get 101 different definitions. There's a lot of different definitions for what is social emotional learning. And I think the way that the folks over at CASEL describe it is a really good way to summarize it in a sentence or two. So they describe it as SEL is how children and adults learn to understand and manage emotions, set goals, show empathy for others, establish positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. And I think that's just a really great kind of one sentence, very clear definition of what SEL is. CASEL goes on to then divide out social emotional learning into 5 core competencies that I've listed here on the slide. Self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. So really briefly, I'll go through each one of these and do a quick summary. But on the CASEL website, they have some videos and further descriptions of each component. So self-awareness is helping students or adults better understand about themselves. Who are they? What are our strengths? What are our challenges? Being able to really articulate who we are as people, and what things come easy for us and what things we might need a little more support on. Self-management is about recognizing our emotions, identifying when we're feeling triggered, and then figuring out how to manage our emotions in a way that our lives are successful and productive. And in there, we also think a little bit more about kind of perspective taking around other people. Social awareness kind of takes perspective taking of others and jumps that up a little bit more. So social awareness is understanding empathy, perspective for others, and really an understanding of the social norms and expectations for how we behave in a given environment. And I think that one's especially interesting right now because the social norms in a classroom for students can be drastically different for many students than the social norms at home. Relationship skills, how do we make friends? How do we navigate relationships in a successful and respectful and empathetic way? And again, the way we navigate relationships at home for many students is very different than the way they're navigating relationships at school in a classroom. And then responsible decision making. Every day, all of us are faced with hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions. And how do we identify what the problem is, analyze our options, and really be able to determine what the best decision might be to solve a particular problem. So I know for some of us on this webinar, you might already be familiar with this, and this is review, and for some of us, this is new information. But I really like to think about SEL in these 5 categories because I think it helps to compartmentalize it a little bit more easily and not feel so vast and vague. So why is SEL important? So there's a few different reasons why I believe social emotional learning is so important. SEL are transferable skills. Social emotional learning are skills that you use no matter how old you are, where you live. You use it in your workplace, you use it in your home life. They are universally transferable. You are using them throughout your life in a variety of different situations and experiences that we're all navigating through. We use SEL in the classroom, and now we're using SEL at home. So I think one of the reasons why SEL is so important is just because it's so universal for all environments in our life. SEL helps to support students as they navigate a more complex digital world. Our world now is so much more complicated than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so I think students need SEL more than ever before because they're having to make decisions about the way in which they interact with people online through various apps, in person. There's just a lot more things that students have to grapple with today in this complex digital society. When we think about the 21st century global marketplace, the way I like to think about it is that students today don't necessarily need to be book smart. They don't have to memorize everything because they can find anything they need right on their phone. But what they need to be successful is they need to collaborate. They need to have empathy. They need to be able to communicate effectively with others. They need to do a whole host of skills that are SEL embedded. And SEL is universal to all students, regardless of age, gender, race, disability. They're really, really universal. So a couple resources I wanted to include on this slide is the Aspen Institute of Social Emotional Learning is where the quote on the bottom left came from. 9 out of 10 teachers believe that social emotional skills can be taught and benefit students. And then on the bottom right is a quote from a report put out by a group called Nation at Hope. And that was a really big report that came out based on the Commission of Social Emotional Learning and Academic Success, I believe a year and a half ago, that really focused on the importance of social emotional learning. So 2 really good resources for some data about the impacts of SEL. So I'm going to pause for a second and make sure there's no questions. All right. So we now know what SEL is. We know why SEL is important. So now what I want to do is jump to where we are right now in the educational landscape. So why SEL during remote learning? Couple of things. Most schools have been doing SEL in the classroom anyway. So just as students are now doing math and English and reading and writing at home, we need to make sure that we're continuing their SEL sequence as well at home. Students are having to transition from one environment to another. This is a huge transition for many students, especially when we think of students who are in households that don't have the supports. They don't have basic needs being met that are being met at school. So SEL can help students transition between being at school and now being at home in a different way. The other reason why I'm so passionate about SEL right now during remote learning is that SEL doesn't just help the students at home, but by providing students and families with SEL resources, we're actually in a way helping all of these family units deal with this COVID situation. We have adults and other siblings at homes, and people are feeling anxious, people are feeling scared, people are feeling nervous, whether that's about the health condition, financial challenges, a variety of other things that different family units are struggling with. And so SEL can really help those. The bottom here is a quote that I found from an article that was published just the other day in Education Week. And it's titled, How to Teach Social Emotional Learning When Kids Aren't in School. And again, another great resource and another kind of validation to the importance of SEL all of the time, but really why it's important now during this remote learning environment.
There was one question, Sam. Someone is wanting to know, do you focus on zones of regulation and SEL?
I think zones of regulation is a component of SEL. And when we think about zones of regulation, I would say that that fits more in the self-management category and really helping students to think about how they're feeling and whether that's in a spectrum or a thermometer. I've seen it in so many different ways. So I think zones of regulation definitely fits into that self-management component.
All right, thank you.
So since the majority of us on this call are educators, what I wanted to do is provide you some tips on ways that I think educators can help with the implementation of SEL activities, programming during the distance learning model. So one thing that I would really emphasize is to select weekly themes. So rather than sharing a activity that fits, let's use those 5 CASEL core standards, right? Rather than doing on Monday self-awareness and on Tuesday self-management and on Wednesday this or that, I think that's too complicated right now. And I've heard that many parents are struggling. So I think the more that you can say, all right, next week, students, we're going to do activities that focus on getting to learn about ourselves. And then the week after that, it's this week, we're going to focus on responsible decision making. So really picking a theme or a SEL focus for the week, I think can be really, really valuable in helping parents be able to support their kids because they know it's one thing they have to remember for the week, and helping kids remember that, again, there's one focus for the week. The other thing that I would suggest is offering short and manageable activities. We need to remember that kids now that are home, there's a host of distractions. There's pets, there's different family members, there's parents that are working from home, there's parents that are essential workers who aren't at home, and kids are being left by themselves. So I think rather than trying to do a lot, I would really encourage this idea of less is more right now. So I would say 15 minutes is probably the max you want to go for an SEL activity at home right now. Keep it relevant. SEL isn't just about learning new skills, but it's also making sure that students have an opportunity to practice those skills. So if you're going to share a social stories, or if you're going to share a video or a sketch that students are going to respond to, keep it relevant. What students are, the emotions that students are grappling with, those are the ones we should focus on. The decisions that students are grappling with, like, do I play Fortnite or do I do my schoolwork, right? Like, those are the things that we want to ensure. So as much as you're kind of creating context and activities around SEL, make them as relevant as possible to your students and what they're going through right now. Each of you know your students and know what sort of family environment they're in right now. So again, just be mindful of that and making sure what we're sharing is relevant. And lastly, vary the type of SEL activities. We want to make sure that students are engaged with this. So maybe one day it's a book that you read on Zoom and ask them some questions. And the next day it's a YouTube video you send them and ask them questions. And the next day it's some sort of just general discussion or response. Really like vary it up. Don't do the same type of literature-based activity or video-based activity every day. So when we think about supporting families through this too, a couple of things to keep in mind. Encourage caregivers and parents to set a routine that they do their SEL work at the same time every day. Now, part of SEL is really about engaging in meaningful conversation. And so I would really encourage you to help your parents and caregivers understand the value of sitting down and doing these SEL activities with their child. It'll also help them as adults as well, right? You know, math, you can send a math worksheet and kids can do that independently. But the more that we can get parents and caregivers to sit and do these activities with their students, the more valuable those are going to be for the kid and the adult in the situation. So by setting a routine, that can also ensure that that parent is there. So if, you know, parents that are essential workers, they're out of work at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, their SEL time is at 5 o'clock or 7 o'clock at night before bed, whenever it might be. The other thing too is to really encourage the caregivers to think about teachable moments. And this actually goes back to picking a weekly theme. If you pick a weekly theme, it can also help parents and caregivers be mindful of opportunities over the week to go back to that theme or go back to that activity. So for example, if the theme is responsible decision making, we can be encouraging our parents and caregivers, you know, throughout this week, every time there's a chance that your child has to make a decision, bring it back to the SEL activities around responsible decision making. So I'll just pause again for a moment for any questions. I know that's a lot of information on kind of ways that educators can help support these SEL activities in a meaningful way at home and help the caregivers and parents engage with their students about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone was asking, what about brain pop? Students like that. So she was saying that they watch it together and answers questions together. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great idea. I think Brain Pop is a really good resource. Some teachers that I've spoken to, speaking of kind of Brain Pop and YouTube videos, I think there's a lot of great resources out there that you can use. I know on the Changing Perspectives website, we've actually curated some videos aligned with those 5 core social emotional competencies, and we have discussion questions already pre-made. And there'll be a link to that on the next slide here in just a moment. Another thing I might encourage you to do is to create like a Google spreadsheet with the other colleagues from your school where you can kind of dump links to YouTube videos and Brain Pop videos, because it's really easy to kind of go through that. I might call it like the midnight rabbit hole where you're like searching for videos, but create some sort of school-wide spreadsheet where everyone in your school can be contributing, and it can help to make things more efficient. So I would definitely encourage videos and discussions are great. And it's also something that you could send to your parents as well. Like, hey, here's a link to the video and here are the questions I asked your kids on Zoom. Consider doing this as a family. And again, it can help the entire family unit deal with some of these challenges they're going through. So some resources, and we'll be sharing these links with you. There's tons and tons out there, but this is a few that I've kind of gone through and I think are really good. So on the nonprofit that I run, Changing Perspectives, we have an SEL distance learning page that's free information. We're adding stuff every week or so. And I'm always soliciting feedback from folks. You know, tell me what you need, and we can create it for you. So we have resources there. On the Castle website, they have this whole portion out called Castle Cares, where they have linked out to other social emotional learning resources specific to helping people through this challenging time. The Child Mind Institute is another great resource. Their resources are more along the lines of managing mental health, but I think that does dovetail pretty closely to some of the SEL. And again, you know your students, you know what they need right now, and that might be some resources. Understood.org is a great resource for specifically learning disabilities and attentional challenges, but they have also created a page on their site with tips for social emotional learning at home. And then Common Sense, they have a website where they have it divided up, not necessarily by those CASEL core competencies, but by different character traits. And you can click a character trait, and then they give you access to free curriculum resources. So these are a few that you might find helpful. There's tons and tons out there, but I wanted to make sure that, that you walk away with this webinar with at least a jumping off point.
Absolutely. We do have a few questions, especially related to resources. So one person in particular is asking of if you know of places to find good videos for behavior. This person teaches SEC and would like to put some videos on behavior for students to watch in her Google Classroom.
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find like one really good channel that focuses on behavior. I have found a variety of different, a video here and a video there. So if you want to email me, whoever asked that question, I'd be happy to share the specific links with you. But I wish there was someone who creates kind of one portal just around behavior, because I know that's definitely a big issue.
Alrighty. And then another person was asking, what are some different resources for students who might have a hard time understanding exactly what's going on in the world right now? And for example, they might keep repeating that, or they might need to keep repeating that they're going back to school in the next month or in summer, and they're just sort of trying to understand that.
I think that's a really good question. And I think one of the challenges too is that every family has their own interpretation really of what's happening right now and what the future holds. And so of course, students being at home 24/7 are hearing the same messages that is what their family believes. And so that can be really ingrained in these students, and it could be really hard to help them think otherwise. So I think it's all about reassuring our students, and also, our brain naturally wants to predict what's going to happen in the future, but helping students understand that we don't really know. And this can link back to kind of self-awareness and self-management, which when we don't know what's going to happen, that instills fear in us. And that's an emotion, and that's how we're feeling, and that's okay. And let's figure out ways to acknowledge that emotion, identify that emotion, and work through it.
Absolutely, yeah. And someone brought up a good point in saying that schools should definitely keep in mind that all staffs have had various levels of trauma throughout this experience. So to prepare for that in the reentry on supporting both staff and scholars. But someone also was asking, what do you think that schools should do to prepare for SEL during reentry?
Gabrielle, I'm so glad you asked that, because that's the next slide. Go back in the classroom. I think regardless of when schools return back to the brick and mortar classroom, I think there is going to be an incredible amount of work that is going to need to be done around SEL. For any kind of responsive classroom teachers out there, typically they do what's called the first 6 weeks of school. My prediction is next year it's going to be the first 6 months of school. We are not going to be able to address any academic regression until we first deal with the social, emotional, and behavioral regression that's occurred during this time. So a few things that I'm thinking about related to when we go back. It's going to be really challenging. The more that we can do SEL at home, that will be a proactive approach for the reintegration. I think when we get back to schools, rather than thinking about it as building climate and culture, we are rebuilding our climate and culture. We are acknowledging that every student has had a different experience with this, right? We have some students who have been at their vacation homes in another part of the country during this time. where we have other students that are, stuck at home all by themselves all day long. We have other students whose parents are actively engaging in their distance learning. We have other students whose parents are not. We have students that have been directly affected from COVID in terms of their own health or the health of loved ones. So I think when we get back, we're really, really, really starting from scratch. And we need to be thinking about acknowledging the different levels of trauma and the different types of experiences that students have had around this. And I think we're going to need to not feel the rush to address the academics and really start with the social emotional learning. I know at Changing Perspectives, we're putting together a variety of programs and services and offerings right now to be ready for that reentry. And I do think it's a hard thing to wrestle with, being responsive to what's happening right now and also thinking about the reentry. But I do think we can't lose sight of the reentry, and the more that we can proactively prepare ourselves, the better. I know we just have a couple minutes left. I want to put this quote up here on the board, or up here on the screen, that I thought was really related to this, and happy to take any more questions in the last couple of minutes here.
Absolutely. And I'll go ahead and paste Sam's email in the chat right now if anyone wanted to write that down. And I will also link again the link to the website where the slides and the recording will be made available. But if anyone does have any last questions, you're welcome to ask them now.
Before we sign off, I'd just like to thank you. I know that everyone, especially teachers, are working long hours right now. So thank you for participating in this. And thank you to the Alliance for inviting me to share. I know that that was a really quick overview on social emotional learning, and there's so much depth we could go into around each of these components, but hopefully you leave with at least some new resources or some new ways that you're thinking about how to support your students at home and support those families in implementing and integrating social emotional learning into their distance learning portfolio. And please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to have individual conversations with anyone or share any more specific resources that you might be looking for.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Sam, and everyone else. In the chat box, people are expressing their appreciation. I don't think you can see it right now, Sam, but
I can't see it, but I appreciate it.
They're thankful. So yeah, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And again, these resources will be made available online afterwards. All right, have a good one.